IVM.
Space exploration was unthinkable for anyone except the US and the USSR in the early 1960s. Today, students and startups can launch satellites. Narayan Prasad joins us on this episode of the Pragati Podcast to tell us about this amazing transformation of human activities in space. Welcome to the Pragati Podcast, a weekly talk show on public policy, economics and international relations. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath. Space was once the final frontier. Paraphrasing Star Trek's famous line, they sought to go boldly where no one had gone before. Space is still that frontier, but now many of us have reached Earth orbital space. It's no longer a frontier, but the mainstay of the human space economy. Over 8,000 satellites have been launched into space since Sputnik, with close to 5,000 remaining in orbit and over 2,000 satellites that are active and functioning. Once this was the domain of a select few spacefaring nations, but today Earth orbital space is within the reach of markets. Narayan Prasad joins us to tell us how this has evolved and what is happening in India. Narayan is a co-founder at Satsearch, a global market space for space, which is incubated by the European Space Agency. He's also an associate research fellow at the European Space Policy Institute, and he helped start New Space India, where a growing group of space enthusiasts and professionals are coming together to form a community in India. We'll start our conversation with Narayan after this short break.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another awesome week on the IVM Podcast Network. If you are not following us on social media, please make sure you do. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You know, the IPL's been going full bore this week or for the last couple of weeks. If you podcast around that, we got a couple of suggestions for you. There is a new show that we've launched called What a Player. It's being hosted by Akash Mehta, the host of Vartalab, and Siddharth Dudeja, who is a really funny stand-up comic. Also on Cyrus Says, we've been doing this Wednesday episode called Lanso, Left Arm Not So Orthodox. On that, Cyrus is talking to a variety of different people about what happened the previous week in cricket. And if you want to get a historical perspective on what T20 cricket is and how it's come about, you might want to check out the show we did a couple of years ago called The Cricketwala Chronicles. It's hosted by Ayaz Memon, and in the first season, Ayaz examines how T20 cricket started. And speaking of the action this week, on The Seen and the Unseen, Amit Verma's guest is the economics editor of The Hindu, Pooja Mehra. The two of them talk about how the Indian economy has struggled in the past decade under two separate governments and prime ministers. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Dhaval Kapadia, director, portfolio specialist at Morningstar. They talk about how you can assess your financial goals in the new financial year. On IVM Likes, Abhineet, Zoya, Madhuri and Radhika, the newbies, give out pop culture recommendations and later take you on a nostalgic journey of 90s pop music. Just so you know, the playlist of 90s songs that they recommended, we're going to make those available on our social media. On our Marathi podcast, Golgappa, Tripti is joined by animal whisperer Anand Shinde, who narrates fascinating stories of human-animal interaction and lays emphasis on the preservation of wildlife. On the Filter Coffee podcast, Karthik Nagarajan is joined by media and creative consultant Ramesh Srivats. They talk about cricket, learning JavaScript, and how Ramesh rose to fame on Twitter. And with that, let's get you on with your show.
Hi Narayan, welcome to the Pragati Podcast.
Thank you, Pavan, for having me here.
Narayan, today we want to talk about space. And recently on the show, I had the privilege of interviewing Major General Charles Bolden as well. And it was a short interview, and we got some gyan from him on, how to think about the space program, human space flight and more. But today I really want to talk to you about how, there was at one point space exploration was first exploration. And then that became, communication and more commercial things. But for the longest time, we could not imagine anyone except sovereign governments engaging in this business of the space economy or space exploration or any part of it. From what I understand, when in India, many people talk about private sector in space, it's mostly as a contractor to the space agency ISRO. Right. But I think world over, we have seen a dramatic explosion of the private space industry over the last, 2 decades or 3. So could you tell us a little about how that happened and what's been happening? And then maybe we'll get to India later in the episode.
All right, sure. So it's a good point to start because we're looking at how the evolution of the space industry ecosystem has happened over the last 50 or 60 years, right? So, of course, going back to the late 50s or the early 60s, space was a very government driven, because also space was very military in that sense. So there was again the Cold War and the space race and so on. So therefore, the governments had priority to be successful because it had a larger context, a geopolitical context to all of this. But then what happened is quickly, when all of these kind of fizzled out, let's say after the Apollo era and so on, and the real commercial aspects of space like communication came up, the industry in the US primarily saw a very big opportunity, as well as in Europe as well.
But this would be big industry, right?
Yeah. So this was more like Ford, Lockheed's, the kind of big kind of industry, because they essentially were already in the aerospace realm. Because, the other part of it is that India has a more developed space program than an aerospace program in that sense.
True.
So historically, the US has a 100+ year aerospace sector, unlike India, for example. So the companies that participated in the aviation or the aerospace world saw space as a natural transition of their new business vertical. And then they stepped into it, and the US government saw this as an opportunity to build or take the IP that they've built and, kind of monetize it. And they essentially gave instruments to the industry, either by procuring some part of the satellite that they're building as a kind of an insurance, so that they have enough demand to at least cover the cost. And they created these policy instruments so that the US industry would then go out to the other parts of the world where those countries would need these satellites and so on, to then capture the demand there and build it as a real kind of economy or a marketplace.
So there was strategic divestment of intellectual property then on the part of the US government to these private companies, or licensing of some or something.
Yeah, so that is one. The other is, of course, there was also a lot of creative policy making, because there was at one point of time they wanted to ensure that there is no conflict of interest between the state or NASA and the industry itself. So they actually created a law that said that NASA is only going to do the things that the industry cannot do. So NASA cannot go ahead and build a communication satellites for, let's say Brazil or somebody like that, right? So that's the job of the industry to do, because they're more efficient. They create jobs in the industry and so on. So they put down a very clear line between what is research that government can drive and what can industry do so it can monetize. So today, for example, there's many incidents, I think, even where SpaceX, for example, can go ahead and sue NASA for doing some part of the work or some sort of a research, which they can say, okay, this is something that we are doing and we are kind of monetizing this, and you're not supposed to do that. So they can legally go and sue NASA for doing
like
that.
The entire opposite of India, right? Where public sector enterprises enjoy all kinds of benefits over their private counterparts.
Yeah. So,
right? Like if you're a government of India employee, you shall only fly in Air India.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So the Europeans also had a very similar approach, where they looked at their legacy industries, how to give them kind of a voice, and how to make sure that they're competitive enough, and also they don't lose the game to the US to altogether. So therefore, and also what happened is a lot of controls were put into place by each of the countries, so that because space is also, again, military and also security related, there were tight controls from each of the ecosystems. So we had similar controls in India too, where we did not allow foreign satellites to be used by end users in India and so on, which also largely exists today as well. So historically, I think the evolution of the industry from the military to then security to then looking at how do you make sure the marketplace remains kind of locally self-served through the local industry, all of that kind of exists. But today, some of these are kind of breaking down, because the evolution from government to business or government supported businesses is now moving into business to business and business to customer in a large way.
Okay. So tell us a little more about that. What changed I can think of the Cold War being an important moment, rather the end of the Cold War being an important moment in sort of changing space dynamics in a big way, because a lot of big investment was competitive, and space tech was also considered dual use, right? So the tech you develop there can also be used for military purposes and so on. So, but what were important developments that enabled the space private sector to evolve?
I would say the fundamental aspect of this is actually what I would say government-supported procurement is probably the most important part of it, which also runs today in a large way. Because, for example, let's say, if you fly a communication satellites, it might cost you $250 or $300 million to build the satellite, another $100 million to launch the satellite. So, and, ground equipment and so on. So it's a $500 million investment. So which means that you need to have some sort of a customer base. And these are very long life cycle projects, right? So because communication satellites takes 5 to 7 years to build, and then it operates for another 15 or 20 years. And so you only, in all the costs that you have incurred, the satellite has to operate for the first 10 years where you can, take back all the costs. And then only the last 5 years that you're operating might be the profits themselves. So the governments understood that this is a very high risk business and we need to kind of support the industry. So what they did is, for example, I think the US government also leased a certain number of transponders on the satellites so that, it gives the impetus to the industry that there is a set customer. Yeah, so it's like a sugar daddy approach, right? So the government came in and said, okay, I will be your sugar daddy for the first few years or a few transponders, and I want this marketplace to kind of mature. And until then, I will be kind of your sugar daddy, where either the government arms will use it for disaster management or some sort of an use case. But then, the industry gets kind of an impetus to go to a bank or a financier to say the government is actually backing me to absorb some sort of a capacity, and I'll be able to monetize the other bits within other, marketplaces, international marketplaces or other end users. It's the same approach for also the imaging satellites, because initially all the imaging satellites were also government driven and so on. But then, they saw that imaging from space has a marketplace of its own, and therefore, so supporting that will also need some sort of a government role. So when they came in, they would always say, okay, we will purchase, 10% of the imaging capacity or 20% of the imaging capacity of the satellite. So which meant that you have a certain amount of capacity already being bought even before the satellite is kind of fully flown and has finished its life cycle, right? So then you would go and say, okay, let me look at how I can take the next 70% and find customers for it. And also you can then say, I will also look at the archival images of the satellite and sell that, and that has a marketplace of its own. So this has been more or less been the evolution for the last 30, 40 kind of years.
So this is also when sort of many aspects of the space sector were not necessarily friendly for pure markets and competitive markets to work, right? So you needed someone to underwrite the risk. You had extremely long investment and return cycles. So you needed someone as a captive buyer of your services or a captive financier or something in order to be able to do this.
Yeah.
But that has now changed for the Earth orbital space, right? I mean, beyond Earth's orbit, it's still a brave new world.
Yeah.
But the Earth's orbit, not just low Earth orbit, but also geostationary, is now something that markets and the private sector can independently look at.
Okay, so firstly, when the market started to evolve, right from the days of the early participation of the industry, the risk for the industry was too big because there were hundreds of millions of dollars being invested. As we discussed, probably for a geostationary satellite, the investment was something like 500 million.
Right.
Or even for an imaging satellite, it was upwards of, let's say, 200 or 300 million. So you needed these governments to be anchor customers, right? But then the shift happened, let's say, in the last 20 odd years, because the electronics really gotten better. And which meant that the size of the satellites for the same kind of capabilities were becoming smaller, right? So let's say, if you took a satellite that is 5 meter spatial resolution 30 years ago, you could build the same satellite today at probably 1/20th of the cost or something like that.
As in something that is doing imaging from space.
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
So which meant that, okay, there was the amount of investment needed was coming down as well, which meant that you could now look at giving the customer also this benefit of reduced prices. So which that meant that, like basically then the venture capitalists would then participate. The major shift, I would say, happened sometime about 10 years ago, when a startup based out of the Silicon Valley called Skybox Imaging essentially raised its complete funding out of VC money. And so that meant that it was 100% upfront privately financed investment, which could not have had the government as an anchor customer.
Or it was not a part of the big sort of military industrial space complex that the United States and other countries had. Right?
Exactly. So which, gave them speed. It gave them a lot of different ambitions and so on. And so that meant that they could pursue building these satellites and exploring these business to business markets and so on. The other bit, of course, is the whole idea of software emerging. Which is basically, if you go back 30 years ago, then if you had to process a satellite image, you would need also very good infrastructure in terms of processing of those images and so on. So which meant that even on the ground, you would need such massive facilities. So maybe 10 years ago, because of the whole, revolution in software and computing and so on, the images that were arriving from space could now, be used or be processed by an array of people on the ground who did not need the same kind of computing capabilities than, 30 years ago. So which meant that there's innovation across the board that allowed the reduction of the cost and then the adoption on the ground in a different way that was done maybe 30 years ago. So that kind of put together many, inflection points together, which allowed this boom.
Okay. So I have two questions. First, I want to understand, when we talk about the space economy or the space sector, what really can you do? I mean, I can think of imaging, I can think of communication. Can you just tell us what is being done?
So basically, you can reduce that into three different parts. So one is your imaging or sensing capabilities, which is all the cameras and all the sensors that you can put in low Earth orbiting satellites, which is, let's say, 500 to 1,000 kilometer satellites. The second is medium Earth orbiting satellites, which is basically 15 to 20,000 kilometers. Where all the positioning, navigation, and timing satellites are. So It's the GPS satellites there, it's the Galileo satellites there, it's the Indian regional navigation satellite systems there, which are all providing the backbone for position, navigation, and timing applications. And the third is the legacy communication applications out of the geostationary satellite systems, and which provide all the communication backbone to direct-to-home television, internet, sometimes even voice, and so on. And the unique bit with India is that India utilized also the geostationary satellites to also do weather and meteorology. Because essentially, the geostationary satellites are always on the horizon of the landmass, which means that you can always keep imaging over a period of time, maybe half an hour
I
or
think
so.
Kalpana 1 and others, we still get images sort of every day, right?
Yeah, so the INSAT satellites were actually pioneering in this concept, where the satellites were also hosting cameras essentially to take the landmass, the entire Indian landmass, the pictures continuously, so that you could monitor the weather and, cyclones and things like that.
Okay. So basically, some form of imaging or sensing. So this can be sort of visible light, IR, it could be radio waves, it could be fancier things, or it is sort of positioning and communication and broadcasting.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what we can do in the orbital space.
At least with Earth.
Okay, with Earth. Yeah, beyond Earth, that's a different ballgame. Now, with all these technological changes happening in software and hardware, were there any big inflection points in, say, the 90s or the 2000s that, changed these satellite costs and other things dramatically?
From the communications perspective, around the 90s and the end of 90s, there was a big boom in satellites as well, where people thought, internet was booming, and people thought, okay, we could provide all these communication links and so on through satellites and so on. And there was a lot of also voice communication. Instead of having GSM, at one point of time, the GSM was competing with the satellites, where the two networks. People thought, okay, the GSM is kind of, it's a mindless investment because you cannot cover the entire Earth. You only have to install towers all across the Earth to cover the entire region. And GSM was a French standard.
Okay.
And these concepts of using satellites to provide voice communication were essentially mostly US-driven phenomena, where people thought, okay, if they could, provide these satellite links, they could connect the whole world, and, the GSM standard would not stand the test of time. But
so
then
this was not CDMA. The CDMA was also a tower-based technology.
So these were two standards that were kind of competing against each other. And a lot of money was poured into all of this during the 90s, and everything got bust because people thought the handsets were cheap, but they weren't. The satellites costed billions of dollars. But essentially, the GSM standard and having towers in places where people could afford to have cell phone connections, all of that won. So there was, of course, the boom and bust in the space industry already in the 90s, and so that was one major inflection point which took people away from space for a while. Because, during that time, there were people from Microsoft and so many other companies who were investing into all of this, and they lost all that money, and which put the industry away for private investment for a solid 2 decades.
Okay.
And now
we may be having another bubble where people are talking about mining in space and other things, and we'll go to Mars and Moon and so on. And maybe we'll talk about that some more, in the second half of our discussion. But the other thing I'd heard about is the CubeSat.
Yeah.
Could you tell us about what the CubeSat managed to do for the satellite sort of unit economics?
Yeah, so from the shift to that boom and bust, what happened is at the end of the 90s, because of the Moore's law, acting up in space and the reliability of electronics going up and so on, one of the research groups in the US, in Stanford and in Cal Poly, were looking at how can you reduce the cost of building a satellite, and also how do you miniaturize a satellite to do different functions and to then reduce the access to space itself, right? And they came up with this CubeSat standard, which is basically trying to commodify satellites themselves, because earlier satellites were built like custom-made, aircrafts or so on. But then, you see that industrialization brings standardization. So that is what they were trying to experiment, where they would try to standardize the volume, the kind of power, the kind of interfaces that were going into satellites and so on. And they were succeeded in flying these 1 kilogram satellites that were 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter by 10 centimeter.
Wow, that's it.
And that's it. And, they were more or less producing just 2 watts of power with two or four solar cells. And they were able to do some interesting things.
So the idea is that when it launches up into space, it's this 10 by 10 by 10.
Yeah.
But once it's released out, maybe it'll extend out some panels and so on.
That is mostly the newer phenomena. But earlier, to reduce the risk, they were just these 10 by 10 by 10 cubes, which had a couple of solar cells on top of them, and that's about it.
A couple of little engines as well, just to do some stabilization?
Nothing at all. Just like, for example, a magnet that would align them to north-south, so the satellite is kind of stabilized, or even not a stabilized satellite at all. Even without a stabilized satellite, you can do some sort of a communication. So the whole idea here is to prove that these microelectronics from the mobile industry or the industrial electronics can be actually used in space, because the reliability of these electronics have gone up so much.
So because they're being mass-produced, the costs are dramatically lower.
Exactly. So which meant that, a satellite that would cost millions of dollars to build suddenly came up to, tens of thousands of dollars.
Okay.
So
the cost of the satellite itself also gets reduced, and because the mass is lesser, the launch cost is also dramatically reduced.
Exactly. So you imagine, in the end of 90s, possibly 1 kilogram must have costed at least $100,000.
Okay.
So it meant that, if you're building a satellite and if it's, 10 kilograms, then you're already spending $1 million just on launch, which is nothing on your hardware, right? The hardware costs are extra on top of that. So this meant that a lot of US universities now could get into space. And they were, this huge revolution of trying to build these 1 kilogram, 2 kilogram satellites in budgets of less than $500,000, which universities, at least in the West, had, access to. And this became a tool in education, a tool in experimenting, a tool in engineering. And people started to use cell phone electronics. People even put cell phones into space and so on. So that was a big inflection point in the industry.
And eventually that entered the private sector as well and went beyond sort of academic experiments and sort of proof of concepts.
Exactly. So over 10 years of experimentation and with a lot of failures, people learned a lot. And people who had the heritage of working with all of this saw an opportunity of these systems, coming up in reliability and so on. And they built business models on top of having these CubeSats do things that other large satellites would not do. So the main difference there is that with the larger satellites, $200, $300 million birds, you can only have so many birds, you 2 or 3 birds for a country, and that's about it. Even for a country of the size of India, you hardly have, let's say, 10 imaging satellites, and that's about it. But then, with these 10 satellites, they're always moving around the Earth, which means that if you want to image a particular location in Bangalore, for example, right, you could only image, let's say, once in 3 days or 4 days, which means that, if you had a larger number of birds, you could image Bangalore every day or even every twice or 3 times a day. So that was the kind of coverage that these satellites were not able to provide, right? And these people targeted that niche, saying, look, we cannot compete against these satellites in terms of quality of the image and the resolution of the image. But what we can compete on is actually the temporal resolution, which is we can image the entire Earth every day.
Okay. And so companies like Skybox utilized all of this technology to build their businesses?
Exactly. So they built a business around selling analytics. Essentially, they wanted to enable a community of machine learning people and people who want to exploit these images and video and provide analytics on, for example, how much oil would be in a refinery, or how many ships are in a port, and so on. So things which acts as intelligence in supply chains.
Perhaps even to understand economic activity, right?
Exactly.
So, I remember coming across this for China, where because Chinese sort of growth numbers are often unreliable, they're sort of just supplied by the state. I remember someone showing these oil drums that were there, where sort of, I think, based on the amount of oil inside, the lid sort of goes up or down. So people would measure the amount of shadow and then be able to say, okay, this much oil was consumed in this area. So, the GDP numbers are inflated by 2% and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And people also try to track, natural resources. Let's say in mines, how much mining activity was happening in competing mines. Or let's say how much crops were being grown across the world. What are the healths of the crops for procurement or insurance and so on. So the whole host of applications came up, and you could also imagine the kind of applications even in the non-governmental sector. Right. So let's say, the war has broken out in Syria or so on. Now you have an independent imaging capability that can give you evidence on the ground as to what is happening, for journalists to do some more groundbreaking work without being actually there.
Right.
So
I think we've seen this play out even in the recent Balakot strikes from India, right? So while India might be giving some information, Pakistan, the two governments and the armies might be giving information, there are satellites that are running around and there are open source data available. So there are before after images from the area as well.
Yeah. And, one of that research is also, groundbreaking from India, is actually from the National Institute of Advanced Studies, where they actually use these open source images to actually look at uranium mining and how uranium mining has been done in regions of interest, and how they could be tracked using open source satellite imagery. So you then open up an entire community. The shift in the business model, of course, is that you suddenly become like an app store.
Right.
where you've created the infrastructure, which is the satellites, and you've created the data layer, which is available for people to do different things on. So somebody can use that pixel to look at some phenomena, and somebody else can use the same pixel to look at a different phenomena. So then, you become this app store, which is a platform where people come to you for different things and you cater to them.
Okay. So with all this happening, tell me a little more about, so you had Skybox as one company, but what's happened since then? Can you tell me about how the sector has grown and where it's largely based now, the private space sector?
So far, the entire growth is, I would say, still US centric. There's been about more than 3,000 or 4,000 new startups in the last 10 years or so.
Wow.
Hardly a dozen of them perhaps are from India. But then largely the growth is 75 or 80% of them are still from the US.
The rest may be Europe and Australia. And
so they're shared. And recently there have also been about 100 Chinese startups coming up in the last 5 years or so. So the whole idea here is that this VC ecosystem is now matured, and the B2B and B2C markets have matured. And that's something that's driven from the US, where the industry has been more matured than any other part of the world. So looking at this, the drivers there are really the new markets that are opening up. So one of the markets, as I said, already talked about, is this whole analytics and intelligence and so on. The biggest thing that people are expecting that would, in the future get opened up is the internet from space. Okay. So as we know, internet is either fiber, which is the mainstream, or basically now telecommunications, or 3G, 4G, 5G, and so on. But then all of these need basically pockets of people present in at least some volume, so that people who are investing into this infrastructure can get a return on top. But let's say there's a town of 100 people or 200 people. Nobody wants to go there and provide connectivity because there's no business model around them reaping enough benefit. So this new generation of satellites, which are attempting to do what happened in the 90s with voice, is now is trying to do something similar with internet. And one of the largest investments has been made by SoftBank into all of this. And SoftBank has possibly invested now over $2.5 or $3 billion into this satellite constellation, which with 900 low Earth orbiting satellites at 1,000 or 1,200 kilometers wants to provide internet across the world.
So there'll be do you need a network of base stations as well and a bunch of these satellites?
Yeah. So basically you would have gateways on the ground architecture and still. But then the whole idea is that these 900 satellites would be able to provide internet to anyone who wants it on the ground, in the air, on sea, whatever. So, right.
So it comes to your cell phone or to your modem or router or something directly.
Yeah. So, and also there's a case where people are talking about, things like connected car, where suddenly you would have these antennas, which are new generation of antennas, which are kind of flat panel antennas, would be integrated into the cars, and you could receive satellite broadband directly into a car, and then you can either watch movies, or you could have autonomous cars, you could have diagnostics on the cars, you could have so many things happen. But these are still, let's say, very early stages of all of this, because all of this is still speculation. The first set of satellites only, I think, are going up now, and it may take 2 or 3 years from now before any number of these satellites would have gone up, and people have rolled out at least a pilot of these services. And also the technology on the ground for antennas and modems and things like that have to mature.
And there will be a competition as well, right? So while we have this big discussion happening now on 5G with Huawei, Cisco, others investing in this space, maybe 6G would be satellite, right?
Yeah, so the fundamental idea is actually the affordability, right? So I often think that most often a lot of the companies around the world use developing countries as their poster child for selling an idea, but not implementing it. right? Because at the end of the day, the whole idea of connecting the last 3 billion people is very good on paper. But then the question is, these last 3 billion people can actually afford something like internet, before having access to food and water and so on, right? So that's the crux of the question. And the idea is, okay, today people are able to buy a cell phone because let's say you get a smartphone in India for 1,000 rupees, right? But then, if the satellite modem or, access to this satellite network in itself is 10,000 rupees, because of the whole initial cost and the cost of the technology itself, I mean, why would somebody want to have, or can people even afford that kind of investment? So, or, will governments actually subsidize this investment so that people can get connectivity? So a lot of these questions are still hanging in the air. And so we'll have to see how all of this kind of plays out in the next 3, 4, 5 years, to see if this is going to be the new norm in connectivity.
Interesting. Could you also tell us a little more about businesses that are actually making revenue from different things? Because, one is, be it in e-commerce or anywhere else, we've seen all these sort of venture capital backed firms where they're essentially still burning VC money. They may have one or two income streams, but costs are way higher than actual incomes. And, the game is scale. At one point you hit scale and then the unit economics work out. But are there companies which are, I don't know about profitable, but able to generate revenue from either businesses or from consumers right now from space tech?
The legacy businesses of broadcasting, direct to home, still remains, I think, one of the largest market shares in space. So you have to know.
India is exceptionally high on that count, right? Because I think, if I'm not mistaken, US, the likes of Comcast and so on, you still have fiber cable network and so on for most of the US. Whereas in India, we had little patchy cable networks that came up, but now pretty much everyone has shifted to, Tata Sky or Airtel or some other DTH service.
Yeah, so that's true for India and many other developing countries in the world. So that's why, DTH is still able to hold ground. But then, of course, the industry is also shaking up there and so on, because you have now a lot of broadband, which can still do, broadcasting kind of functions where you could still, shift video from DTH to actually to broadband and so on. So there's some friction there as well in the industry. But then the whole idea here is that space is a $300+ billion industry, right? So it's a massive industry in that sense. It grows 7 to 8% every year. So it's been growing that way for the last 10 or 20 years. So it's definitely, there's a lot of room to grow. The question is, how do you derive value for people on the ground? Right. So people derived value out of communication for a long time. But now, the new markets that are opening up is essentially this sort of an intelligence based on imagery, based on video. So what happens if somebody is able to give you a 90-second video of some point on Earth, which may be useful in some form or the other? So these are questions that people are trying to answer, so that the intelligence that you can get out of these images and video and the new things that are coming out, what's the value of that data? Right. So I recently saw a very interesting analogy of data in itself. Right. So somebody said, look, a piece of iron in itself, if you mine it, it's probably worthless because iron is kind of everywhere. But then, suddenly if you make like an iron rod out of it, maybe it's worth $5. And if you make, let's say, pins out of it, which are critical for surgeries and so on, maybe it's worth $1,000. And maybe if you make, very important part for a watch out of it, on the same iron quantity, you can make 100,000 of them. But then now that's worth $1 million. Right. So the same piece of iron, you could make something, you could sell it for nothing, or $5 or 1,000 or $1 million. So data is essentially the same game, right?
Right.
So the data in itself could be worthless the way you present it, but then the information or the intelligence that you can extract out of this kind of data could change markets, or could be valuable or invaluable for many of the markets there, right? So the smart people out there are trying to find what is that $1 million question that they could answer with this data.
Narayan, thank you so much. Let's take a small break on our Pragati Podcast episode today. And after the break, let's talk about two big things that we've not yet spoken about. One is the elephant in the room, SpaceX, and the other about what's happening in India and, what needs to change for the Indian space, the private sector to also evolve significantly.
Do you wish you were smarter? Well, so do we. But the next best thing?
We could make you sound smarter.
And to help you with this endeavor, we are Simplified, a podcast that attempts to break down the complex world around you with a little knowledge, a lot of poor jokes, and a ton of random trivia.
Episodes out every Monday.
On the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.
See ya!
Welcome back to the Pragati Podcast. I'm your host, Pavan Srinath, and here with me in studio today is Narayan Prasad. Narayan, and we've been talking about the private sector in space. And the one thing that we have not yet spoken about is SpaceX. Right? So most people would not know about most of the startups and the applications that you mentioned earlier, but pretty much everyone knows about SpaceX. And the way perhaps NASA was equated to space exploration in the 20th century, for a lot of people over the last 5 years, the pioneer in that has been SpaceX, right? Deserved or not. So can you also tell us about what's happened with launch vehicle technology and the privatization there? And what is the big sort of economic and technological challenge that is being solved?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I had a chance to actually visit SpaceX about 3 years ago, where I went to the factory and had an entire day there and spent a lot of time on their shop floor and looked at everything that they were trying to do. And it is definitely kind of fascinating. There's fundamentally, I think, the technology aspect as well as the economics aspect, which are different in SpaceX than any other company so far, or even the governments, right? So from a technology standpoint, it's the focus on reusability and so on. The idea is that rockets that are flown a single time adds a lot of burden on the satellite makers, which meant that, as I said, earlier in the episode, $250 million for a spacecraft and $100 million for launch meant that, 1/4 or so on is still your launch cost that you'll have to then pass on to the customer to recover back. So the communication industry became very interested in reusability, because essentially what SpaceX said is that because of our reusability, you will be able to get a reduced price where you could launch your payloads at, let's say, $40 million instead of $100 million launch.
So in this, the typical unit that is talked about is cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit, right? So currently, what are the industry rates like for cost per kilogram to low Earth orbit?
Yeah, so it's a tricky question in that sense, because the kind of launch vehicles are very different, because the PSLV sort of a launch vehicle doesn't target really geo launches. Right. So which PSLV, I would say the ballpark figure as kind of a guesstimate would be somewhere about $30,000 to $40,000 per kilogram.
$30,000 to $40,000.
Yeah.
Not less than $10,000.
No, I don't think so. Right.
Okay.
So at least
this
commercially.
This is to low Earth orbit.
Yeah, this is to something like 500 to 1,000 kilometer kind of an orbit, right? But then the geo launches, or the communication satellite launches that are launching 2, 3, 4 ton kind of satellites, their unit economics is much different, because you're talking about a much heavier launch vehicle and so on. So, for example, I think the SpaceX, Falcon Heavy or something is 8 or 10 times bigger than a PSLV. Right. So the unit economics are much different there. And there, of course, it is still now a few $1,000, maybe $5,000 per kilogram and so on, but to geo or something like that. The unit economics work in that regard. But then because of the reusability in play as well.
So with reusability, you can have units coming down to a couple of $1,000 per kilogram to low Earth orbit, right?
Yeah.
That's the promise or the premise.
Yeah. In fact, actually, there's a very nice paper by Dr. B.N. Suresh, who was the former head of VSSC, where he's talked about the future of Indian rocketry and so on. And I think he even proposed that the Indian reusable launch vehicle will have unit economics of something like $500 per kilogram.
Okay. I'm asking this also because in India, there's often very loose talk in newspapers saying, oh, India has one of the cheapest launch vehicle technologies in the world. And I think the Indian launch vehicle tech is certainly globally competitive. And it's something that any satellite maker and anyone who wants to launch a satellite does look at PSLV as one good solid option that is competitive with others. But I don't think there's been any evidence so far, either technical or otherwise, that somehow PSLV is way cheaper than anything else, right? And none of them are reusable right now, except for what SpaceX is doing.
Yeah, so in pure numbers, I think from a sense of the industry, right, I guess why people come to the PSLV in a big way, I think, is because of the reliability more than the cost. Because, I mean, ultimately, even if you pay $50 for a launch and you've spent, $1 million on your satellite, and the launch vehicle is not good enough to take you to space, and you lose $1 million by only saving a few $1,000,
right,
it doesn't make any sense. Right.
So there's a risk premium involved and a time premium involved as well, right? Because
exactly.
these things take a long time to construct.
So, but then, the current technology that we have in India is legacy technology, which is rockets that are possibly 50 years old in the technology sense. But then there's a new generation of people who are building new class of rockets or new technologies of rockets that want to use additive manufacturing, 3D printing, that want to use liquid fuel only rockets instead of solid fuel. So there's a lot of challenges in the legacy rockets, for example, PSLV and so on. Because one, solid rockets like the PSLV, it still uses solid rockets in a sense that they are extremely, you have to take a lot of care to fly them because they're extremely flammable, explosive, and solid rockets, they moving them, handling them, and also the fuels that are used in many of these cases are all corrosive. It could exposure to them by people directly can also cause a lot of harm and so on. So the new generation of rockets are looking at avoiding a lot of the solid based fuels. Firstly, because it adds a lot of cost and risks, so we want to avoid that. And also, they want to be able to launch out of any place in the world and so on. So if you have a solid rocket motor, you have to, clear the area, have a fixed launch vehicle spot and so on. But then let's say you have a hollow rocket, which has no fuel inside, but then you can move that rocket to probably any place in the world and then fuel it wherever you want to launch and then, launch, right? So that kind of architectural changes are happening in the launch vehicle space.
But even with liquid fuel rockets, we've seen space shuttle after space shuttle crash, right? And they were also sort of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. So are there new fuel technologies that are also changing there? New fuels that are safer to handle? Because liquid hydrogen is not exactly the safest thing to use.
Yeah, I think, I'm not really a launch vehicle expert per se, but then I think that there is some innovation happening there where people are talking about kind of green propulsion kind of substances where essentially it will also be kind of easier to handle on the ground. And also I think people like SpaceX are also looking at the future where, methane or kind of carbon-based fuels in that sense can be extracted from surface of Mars or so on, can be used as fuel to be, bringing back people onto the Earth because you don't have fuel depots or something like that already there, right? So there's also a lot of forethought on that front. But then again...
Which is, again, an entirely different ballgame from orbital space and most of what we've discussed so far today.
Yeah, absolutely. But then the key metric in all of this is actually the volume of the number of launches, right? Because the world in its entirety for the last 50 years did not foray into reusability at such a large scale because people didn't have, I guess, so many satellites to fly at a given, point of time, right? So even today, across the world, there are about 100 launches that happen every year, right?
Okay, just 100.
Just 100 launches that happen.
I thought ISRO wanted to get to, was it 2 launches per month as their own target, and they've not yet gotten there.
No, they've not yet gotten there, I think. But, even today, that's the kind of a metric that is happening. Because of the smaller rockets, that metric might go up. But then the idea is smaller rockets don't fetch you so much money as the larger communication satellites do, right? And so if you look at SpaceX, for example, I think they're now possibly handling more than 50% of the world's geo launches, right? So which meant that their unit economics improves and they're able to then build a rocket every 7 days, test it out and qualify it and integrate a satellite in the next week. And within a span of 14 days, they are ready to launch a satellite to the geo orbit, right? So which meant that once the rocket comes back after landing, they're again going to kind of refurbish everything and then be able to launch again. So from what I heard from some of my friends, they were looking at using a rocket over and over about 12 to 18 times.
With what kind of a gap in between, say 3 to 6 months to?
No, so the idea was that within 2 years, they wanted to demonstrate something like 24-hour refurbishment time.
Wow. Okay, so something that takes the stresses of launch and return and is able to go up again within no time.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So, but then the natural question to ask is, is there so much demand after all? So that is something that I think we haven't, or the industry at large hasn't answered it very well, because I don't see a world where people will be launching every day, hundreds of satellites. I don't think so. We are there at that moment in time where the unit economics or the downstream need for that kind of launches is there today, right? So today, I think there's a massive bubble in the number of people who want to become Elon Musks, in a sense. And I feel that today there's probably 75 or odd launch vehicle startups, possibly even like 1/3 of them may be VC funded in some form or the other.
Others will be sort of rich entrepreneur funded, right? Like Jeff Bezos has his own space launch vehicle company.
Yeah.
And
so there are a few credible ones like from SpaceX, as well as then, Jeff Bezos. And then there's also Richard Branson, who has his own launch vehicle company and so on. So there's a lot of that billionaire money rocket driving thing. And so there's a few ones that want to catch up with the Americans. Like the Europeans are thinking about having their own reusable launch vehicle technology or smaller rockets and so on. So are the Chinese and so on. So there is, again, a sense of national pride and a sense of regional capacity, all of this fueling some of this entrepreneurial efforts as well. But then the question is, all of this will play out, and I don't think there is space for more than half a dozen of these vehicles to exist eventually.
So you're thinking in the near term, the world will not need more than, I don't know, a few hundred launches a year.
I would say,
less than 1,000.
For sure. I mean, as I said, I don't see, just think of what will happen even in space if that happens, right? So let's say people are sending all these satellites every day. And so one of the new areas that people are really discussing a lot is space traffic management.
So this is, the fear is, am I getting this right? The Kessler syndrome?
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So you have too many orbital objects in similar orbits. And then if enough of them start crashing into one another, then you could have an entire envelope of debris around us.
Yeah.
That's not just stationary, but moving extremely quickly in all kinds of directions, right?
Exactly. And then you probably would never be able to go back into space again.
So let's come back to that. I want to come back to that because I want to talk to you about something that you've also worked on in the past, which is about space law and what are the critical questions that I think we need to answer there. But let's now come to India. So you also helped start a space startup here in India. This is Dhruva Space, right?
Yeah.
And how do you see the sector evolving here? And what do you think are the critical sort of policy questions that we need to think about and answer in India?
Yeah, so historically speaking, the evolution of the Indian industry into the ISRO realm probably happened sometime during the 70s when Professor Satish Dhawan was the chairman. And he, I think, constituted a committee that was looking at how do you integrate industry into ISRO, and essentially a bunch of SMEs came up and said, okay, we would like to learn from you as to how, we could produce this for you and so on. So that's been more or less the case for the last 40 or 50 years, where a bunch of small and medium scale enterprises have essentially got hand-holding or technology or know-how in some form or the other from ISRO, where their job is to then learn and then produce the same thing and then give it back to ISRO. So this way, ISRO engineers can do some new work when the established work can be moved on to the industry. This doesn't
So it's largely outsourcing then?
Yeah, it's some form of established IP outsourcing.
Okay.
Where essentially, I would say none of the players in the Indian market still have the know-how of how do you build an entire mission top kind of bottom up. If you have a requirement from somebody, how do you build it up into an entire segment as an end-to-end system? Because they've been always treated in this kind of a way, right? And I guess it was natural in a sense that one industry may not have had that kind of an appetite to invest on its own or take a risk. And also, I guess ISRO feared that some of this, needs a lot of investment and there's a lot of failure, and maybe industry cannot absorb that kind of a failure.
No,
right?
and also, launch vehicle technology has always been extremely tightly controlled, right? Because it can be used for all kinds of things. An intercontinental ballistic missile is not that much different from something that puts a satellite in low Earth orbit. So to me, honestly, it's amazing that you have even SpaceX or someone else in the world now, and sort of governments trusting these and building those relationships of trust where they allow these private companies to actually launch things that could be used as missiles as well.
Yeah,
right.
But there are, of course, now private companies that are building rockets, including, for example, SpaceX and so on. So it's a matter of how you approach policy making, as well as, how do you govern IP, as well as, the behavior of these companies, right? So what is not ripe in India still, I think, is giving a space to new innovators and new thinkers, and kind of a new sector of people who are trying to take risk in a certain way and trying to build more of a B2B kind of a business, or a B2C kind of a business. I think that's still at a very premature stage in India. Because one, I think the ecosystem is still not ready in a sense, because largely the legacy of India in space is, the government doing everything and industry being treated just as a vendor for some X, Y, and Z. And anything that is kind of B2B has not found traction. So in fact, actually, the promoter of ZTV or so on had a company back in the day, I think in the late 90s or so on, which wanted to foray into communication satellites. And they formed one of the earliest companies in India where they wanted to buy a couple of communication satellites from the US, and they had applied for a license from India. And I think that's when, they instituted the SATCOM policy.
Okay.
Right. So again, it's not a law. It's just a policy, which meant that today, for example, the company that was called the Agrani or something like that. And then they are the only beneficiaries who have gotten license ever since the SATCOM policy has come up.
Okay.
Right. Although I think 3 or 4 other companies have filed for these, licenses, they have never been given those licenses. I know a company, for example, here in Bangalore that's filed a license for 5 years now, and they haven't really got that license. Also because, one, there's no time cap on these policies, right? So if you apply for a license, the government may take its own time of giving it and so on. So there's, again, how you address it is depending on your policymakers. For example, I think in Canada, for example, they have a 180-day or a 90-day time for the bureaucrats to address some of these issues, where somebody applies for a license. If you don't get an answer from the government in 90 days, it's a green light automatically.
Yeah. And we've seen some of those kinds of policy changes happen in other sectors in India.
Yeah.
I think for drug regulation or regulation of biosimilars and so on, you just change the default, right? So in this period, if the government does not object, then you get it. As a government. So the onus is on the regulator or the license grantor to take action and take effort in stipulated time. So that's one. Even when it comes to, for example, if I'm not mistaken, India is one of the largest direct-to-home TV broadcasting systems in the world. That Tata Sky, the Airtel TV, all of that. And so here also there are lots of regulations, strictures by ISRO, right? You can't just buy transponder space sort of from any geostationary satellite and use it, right?
Yeah, that's right. So the intent was, I think, that the Indian capacity should be built up to service the Indian market. which is, the right way to do it.
I think the second intention was also to have control. I don't think anyone wanted Pakistan TV in India, if I can be blunt about it.
Yeah. So one is, of course, security and so on. The other is, protecting your own market so that you can access it yourself and so on. So the problem is that, yes, there is this format and the intention is right and so on, but the execution is where, the details lie, right? So far, I think this whole thing has led to the boom in the TV industry, but then the capacity not being present to service that, which means that at some point of time, I think even 70 to 80% of all the Indian transponders were actually foreign based. And Antrix Corporation was the middleman in between who had to, basically lease it out from the foreign vendors and give it back to the Indian vendors. And the problem with that is that normally the leases are 15-year time frames. And so you get a better deal going into 15-year leases. But then since ISRO wanted to establish those satellites, the leases were only for 2 or 3 years, which meant that the prices of these transponders were very high and then passed on to the customers and so on. So you had to constantly also switch between satellites and so on. So there's that element as well. But then we also haven't seen the participation of large Indian industry of, let's say, Reliance or L&T or somebody like that, who has come up and said, okay, let me invest few hundred crores in building a communication satellite and, provide the capacity by myself to all these DTH providers. That also not occurred. So I feel personally that, that is also something that could have occurred, but somehow it has not transpired.
Okay. So, but in this, let me ask a few basic questions that have been plaguing me for a while. One, do we allow FDI in space-related technology and ventures?
Yes. So recently, the FDI limit has been raised to, I think, 100% FDI.
Okay.
But I think not with automatic approval. I think it is through Government of India approval. But I think even before it was something like 74% or so on.
So this is in what part of space-related technology? Satellites and communication, launch vehicles?
So I think they say satellite communications, and they don't say it is launch vehicles or so on.
Okay.
So those are very hazy areas from what I know.
Right.
So if somebody wants to invest in a space startup that is doing launch vehicles from a fund abroad or so on, I think that's a very gray area at the moment.
Okay. So maybe the lack of regulatory clarity is also leading to people not choosing to invest. If, for example, ISRO is your only buyer of technology, then it becomes like defense, right? So you are dependent on a government procurement cycle. And even if ISRO is way better than whatever nightmare we have going on with our defense procurement, you're stuck with one buyer, right? Rather than, but in this FDI, can you also do space applications where you're providing services to an end user?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it, I guess, depends on the kind of market that you are targeting. Because essentially, let's say you are, a machine learning AI company that is going to use space images and so on. I don't see any problem because you will be treated as a software company. Essentially, because you're not in the business of building satellites or so on. You're just in the business of using data. But there, for example, the policy that might govern you is what we call as the remote sensing data policy, which is that if you're using images of that is less than 1 meter resolution, then you will need to have government clearance to use that. And if you're using anything above, you can just go ahead and use it.
And I think we still have some archaic laws from the Survey of India times about what kind of data and imagery and satellite stuff you can use near the borders of India, and that includes the entire coastline of India as well. And so we have a lot of legacy laws that might get in the way and just provide regulatory uncertainty, right, for anyone to actually invest and hope that the business survives long enough and the government doesn't come and kill it one day with implementing something. Yeah,
from a purely, let's say, policy standpoint, right, for any space service, there are multiple agencies that have interest. For, let's say, in the case of geospatial data, images and so on, there is Ministry of Home Affairs that may be interested, Defense that might be interested, Intelligence that may be interested, ISRO, of course. They may be, Survey of India that might be interested in all of this. So again, if you look at the communication space, then DOT and WPC may be interested in it. Again, MHA may be interested in it. ISRO may be defense. So again, the whole idea is you need to kind of harmonize all of this from a standpoint of how do you make it easier for the end citizen, not even a customer, just the citizen of the country, to access certain services, right? Because essentially, if you use the lens of security for everything, there is no way that you can promote innovation. So most often what happens is, I think people are afraid because they often use the lens of security and they don't want to move ahead at all. Nobody wants to take blame for something that might happen and so on. So, but then, there's no brave soul in all of this. And the second bit is who coordinates between government bodies and departments is a question that I've not seen answered across the board. Because that in itself is a huge job. If you have to bring secretaries of government of India bodies, and essentially given that Secretary of Department of Space is in Bangalore and Secretary of DOT is in Delhi, for example, right? Which means that, they're in two different places at any given point of time. And even getting 2 or 3 secretaries into a room to have them agree on something is a big challenge in itself. And the question is, whose job is it to do it?
Narayan, we've seen premises of ISRO's work in India being how they're supposed to provide space-based services to various people in the country in various sort of sectors, from agriculture to fisheries to various other places, right? I mean, I think Vikram Sarabhai's stated vision for the Indian space program was also space for development rather than just for exploration's sake or something. So in this, ISRO claims to be doing a lot of things, and I've seen some of them, but can you talk about how they actually reach people who actually get to use it? And does the private sector get to play any role in that part?
Yeah, so the ISRO, I think, from my perspective, has uniquely catered to some of the socio-economic challenges in India and have identified a lot of it. It is essentially because if you go back to the days of Sarabhai himself, or even after that, there were a lot of sociologists and anthropologists and people who are not really science and technology, hardware science and technology kind of folks, but who really connect with the society and its problems, who were involved in building up the space missions and so on, right? So they identified the end users or citizens who are affected by certain problems or certain challenges which can then be addressed by space. So fisheries is again an excellent example there, because essentially India has a 7,000 or 8,000 kilometer coastline, and there's a lot of fishing communities, and they're also under the risk of the weather and the high seas and so on. So the idea was, can you actually provide them coordinates of where the fish would be, so that they can directly go to the spot and in fish and come back. So I read a paper a few years ago, for example, where ISRO had piloted this technology, and they essentially used the chlorophyll content as well as the sea surface temperature to provide the coordinates of where the fish, the algae would be, where the fish would be. And then they projected that, the fishermen saved significantly in terms of the diesel they had to invest into the fuel. For it was also benefiting the environment because less fuel, and then their catch would go up by 30 to 50% and so on. So they'd get a better catch at the end, right? So the question is, how is in the detail of execution. Because this particular application was pioneered maybe 20 years ago, internet was not prominent, mobile phones were not prominent and so on. So they actually, the only way they could reach the fishermen by themselves was through another government of department, which is the Fisheries Survey of India. So they tied up with them, I think, and they were faxing essentially the coordinates to the Fisheries Surveys of India, and then they would pass it on. Right. But then I think it evolved into also them having then to use internet to give these coordinates. I
remember seeing a web live image of this sea surface temperature anomalies and I think some chlorophyll index.
Yeah. Right? So, but then the question now is, today is like the smartphone world, right? Even I would say with 500 million smartphones possibly, being in India, there's an opportunity to directly address the citizen rather than go to, the citizen from another government arm. So instead of a G to G2C, you go government to citizen directly, right? And that's where I think you can also achieve scale. because, whoever be the government arm and so on, at the end of the day, the reach to a citizen through government arms will always be limited when it, passes on from one hand to the other and then back, right? So I would say there's some more architecting that is kind of needed, where you can now look at space missions being executed from an end user perspective, where access through smartphones or devices like that can be catered, and it should be a part of mission architectures. And that's when you can go from addressing directly the end users. So
instead of a village knowledge center with a sat link and an old computer lying in a coastal village where the fisherman is supposed to go and check, the information comes to a smartphone or some other device such that it can actually be used and acted upon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's where the future is, especially. But then, the question is, how do you change the legacy architectures? Who does all these changes and so on? So that's the question. And it's also a largely software play. I often keep telling people that software is definitely eating space. And most often the legacy institutions that we have think in terms of hardware. People tell how difficult is it to build satellites, how difficult is it to build rockets and so on. But then people never talk about how easy it is to build, end user solutions which can use software in an intelligent way to cater to the end users. So that will need some shift as well. And that is where I think maybe the private sector can also act.
Narayan, thank you so much for coming on the Pragati Podcast. It was an absolute pleasure to have you here. And we hope to have you back here in a few months and maybe talk about different aspects of space exploration as well.
All right. Thank you, Pavan, for having me.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for staying with us till the end. If you have any questions or suggestions, do write into podcast@thinkpragati.com. Follow New Space India on Twitter if you want to stay plugged into what is happening in the Indian space sector. And you can follow Narayan at Cosmos Guru. And hey, if you like the podcast and listen to us on iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. It'll mean a lot to us. The Pragati Podcast is available on the IVM Podcast app and pretty much every other podcast app and platform. We are there everywhere.
Filter coffee is a fascinating beverage. You need to pick the right beans, blend them in the right proportion, roast them to perfection, and slow brew at the right temperature to get the perfect cup. Which is exactly like great conversations as well. You need to track down the most interesting minds, get them into their zone, and settle down for an unhurried, unscripted chat. And coffee for me is always, always, always best enjoyed with friends. I'm Karthik Nagarajan, and do share my table as I meet some of the most interesting people I know and sit them down for a strong cup of coffee and an even stronger conversation. Join me every Wednesday for a freshly brewed episode. This is not frappe. This is the Filter Coffee Podcast.
Hi listeners, we at Aditya Birla Sun Life Mutual Fund have come up with a special podcast series called MF 101 in collaboration with Bloomberg Quint. MF 101 is an informative series that will help you understand the recipe behind mutual fund investments. And what's more, it's coming from the chefs of the mutual fund buffet table, from the very own fund managers and analysts who are the manufacturers of the funds that help you realize your investment goals. New episodes out every Monday. You can listen to the show on the IVM Podcast app or wherever you get your podcasts.